So this is a really relevant topic for Agile practitioners. One of the challenges that we have observed with our clients, and I'm sure many of you who are practitioners of Agile, you've probably noticed, one challenge that Agile process has is it assumes that somehow magically there is a prioritized backlog and there's a single ringable neck, as they say, a product owner who is able to produce that magical prioritized backlog that the Agile team can pick from. And that's obviously an unrealistic assumption, and most of the times is completely wrong anyways. So addressing that issue, how do you build the right product backlog? How do you build the right product and follow Agile practices? That's what we'll cover today. And the answer really lies in following the lean startup principles that have been espoused by Eric Ries's book, and we'll cover this in a lot more detail, to build the right product with market feedback and so on. So that's the topic today, and I'm delighted to have Michael Hall cover that. But before I introduce Michael, let me go over some of the logistics as usual for the session. We have about an hour or so for the webinar today. Of that, 45 to 50 minutes or so will be the webinar main content session, and we'll take some questions along the way as you guys put them in the Q&A panel, and I'll play the moderator role to pick the questions that need to be answered along the way. And then we'll still reserve another few minutes at the end to cover general broader questions covering the entire topic. And we'll make the document available to you after the webinar today, so you'll receive that follow-up email, and we'll also record it, so those who registered and missed it will have opportunity to listen to the recorded version of today's webinar. With that, let me introduce our speaker, Michael Hall. Michael is CEO and founder of 3 Beacons, and Michael is a software practitioner and team leader. He's certified Scrum Master and certified Scrum Product Owner, and of course an early adopter of Agile methods since 2001 timeframe. And the firm he is founder and CEO of 3 Beacons is a leading provider of Agile training and consulting services. So with that, over to you, Mike.
Okay, folks, welcome to today's session on Lean Startup and how to apply it to Agile projects. We've got a lot to cover, so let's get started. Now, the first half of the webinar is a review of Lean Startup. For those of you that are unfamiliar with Lean Startup, this will give you some foundational understanding of the approach. And for those of you that are not, for those of you that are familiar with Lean Startup already, it'll be a concise review and a good cross-check of your understanding and mine. Now, Lean Startup was published in 2011, authored by Eric Ries. And one point Ries makes several times in the book is that the approach is not just for startups. It can be used by any company for new product or new feature development. And also throughout the book he uses this term entrepreneurs, but qualifies it by saying that even long-standing companies can have entrepreneurial thinkers as part of their innovation team. Now, in the book, Ries asks a fundamental question. What if we found ourselves building something that nobody wanted? In that case, what did it matter if we did it on time and on budget? So, Agile methods are not good enough. Even with using Agile methods, you can effectively build the wrong product. And as a matter of fact, this was the exact situation that Ries found himself in and was the motivation for him writing the book. His team at IMVU developed what they thought was a great messaging product using Agile methods, and turns out the customers wanted something different. So that began his exploration into how that could have ever happened, and the result was Lean Startup. Now look at this picture. You'll notice that the remodeler or construction person has placed the toilet paper roll inside the shower area, and it's quite a far distance away from the toilet. So there's a number of things wrong with this, and this is clearly the wrong product. So again, Agile doesn't guarantee necessarily that you're building the right product. Obviously, there's prioritization within the product backlog, but if unless you're testing those assumptions, it's definitely possible that you're building the wrong product. And Lean Startup helps to fill that gap. So typical thinking at a traditional product visioning meeting might be, well, can we build a solution for that problem? And Lean Startup says, a better approach is to ask some other questions. For example, do the customers recognize that they have a problem? And if there was a solution, would they spend money for it? And most importantly, would they buy it from us? And then finally, okay, can we build a solution for that problem? And then Reese is very emphatic on this point also. And will that lead to a sustainable business around that product or service? So in other words, ask, should we build it instead of can we build it? Okay, so with that kind of overview, let's look at the Lean Startup as a framework. It's actually a very scientific framework involving identifying your assumptions, rewording those into hypotheses, and then running experiments to prove or disprove each of the hypotheses. And all throughout Lean Startup is an encouragement and focus on learning. Now let's jump into the specific principles of Lean Startup before we actually talk about applying them to Agile projects. So Lean Startup says to constantly discuss your project assumptions in an honest and transparent way. For example, we assume our customer would prefer a downloadable SDK library instead of a cloud-based web service. Another one might be, we assume our customer wants our in-car navigation unit to remain on for 30 seconds after turning off the car. And so we're going to take these assumptions and reword them into hypotheses. So you'll see a couple of examples there. There's really two types of hypotheses, a value hypothesis and growth hypothesis. So a value one would read something like, the XYZ change will prove that customers want to fill in the blank. And a growth hypothesis would read, the ABC feature will increase new customers by at least 15%. Again, these are examples. But the worst thing you can do is start a project based on leaps of faith with all kinds of baked-in assumptions. So ask yourself, how many times in your career have you started a project that had all of these assumptions baked in? And if you're like me, and that has been numerous times or more than plenty, then Lean Startup is a potential cure for that. Let's talk about two teams here. On the left side, you'll see a typical team that has some great debates about the product, and at some point an executive makes a statement to either break a tie or decide the path forward. And even though the team might feel successful, it's likely that they're not building the right product. And let's compare and contrast that with a team that's identifying their assumptions as they go. They're rigorously translating those into hypotheses. They're running experiments to learn and to prove or disprove those hypotheses. And yes, the major focus is on learning. There's a good chance this team will actually build the right product. Lean Startup also says to define your work items as experiments to prove or disprove the hypotheses. And then based on these learnings, make righteous decisions about the product. let's talk about a case study, Zappos. Some of you are familiar with this. The company founder ran an experiment to test his hypothesis that there was actually a demand for buying shoes online. And so his experiment was he went to local shoe stores and asked if he could take pictures of their shoes in exchange for coming back and buying them if they sold on his online website. And throughout the course of this, many other assumptions were identified and tested, and changes made as they interacted with customers, handled payments, handled the logistics of returns, etc. And this approach was much better than leaps of faith based on hopes and guesses. And in 2009, Amazon acquired Zappos for $1.2 billion, and that's billion with a B. So, most importantly, experiments allow us to transition away from guesses towards knowledge. And the learnings from these experiments allow us to work based on knowledge instead of the assumptions and guesses. Another lean startup principle is validated learning. Validated learning is the result of running the experiments. And I really like the word validated, as it implies a measure of proof and objective data-driven findings. And one interesting aspect of validated learning is that it actually is faster and more accurate than market forecasting and classical business planning. And that's a point Reese makes in his book with some data to back that up. So the measure of an effective team is how much validated learning did we achieve, as opposed to how many new features we built or what our burn down rate is or other measurements. Another lean startup principle is small batch size. This is a critical principle of lean startup, and it basically says that we're going to identify the smallest amount of work effort that represents an experiment upon a hypothesis, and then do that work and learn. And again, avoid large batch sizes because they can be a continuous cycle of redoing work. Now, if you're familiar with Lean Startup, you've heard of the build, measure, learn loop, and it's at the heart of Lean Startup. So the first thing we're going to do is, after identifying our hypothesis, we're going to build the smallest batch possible of those experiments that test out that hypothesis. And then secondly, we're going to measure the results objectively as possible, and that measurement can be qualitative and or quantitative. And then third, we're going to learn, and the way we learn is we discuss the measurement data and let it speak to us. And then these learnings should prove or disprove the hypothesis. And then finally, we're going to make a decision for the product and rinse and repeat. And the project itself becomes a successive continuance of build, measure, learn loops. Okay, minimum viable product. We've all heard this term from the standard lean agile method. It's a popular technique to ensure that the team is focused on the right set of features and stories to issue release 1 at the earliest opportunity possible. And it also helps us avoid gold plating and just throw something else to the list or of the product and hope it sticks, and ending up with a big giant mess. Now, minimum viable product. Lean Startup also has this concept as inherited from Lean. The MVP consists of product features and stories that are a result of the validated learnings achieved by running experiments on hypotheses. Now that's quite a mouthful, but it's simpler than it sounds. Just think of the minimal marketable product, the end result, as a collection of build, measure, learn results which constitute a good enough product. So you'll see there in the diagram, we're going to work on our MVPs as we go, and over time it transforms into a minimal marketable product. And then let's see. Let's look at a case study. Dropbox is a good case study for an MVP. Dropbox is a very popular web-based file sharing service. Their first MVP was simply a video on YouTube describing their vision of sharing files and asking folks to sign up for the beta product. And their beta product waiting list went from 5,000 to 75,000 overnight. The company is now worth over $1 billion. There are some patterns, some different types of MVPs. Let's briefly discuss 2 or 3 of these. There's a Wizard of Oz MVP, and it's exactly what you think it is. Something magical seems to be occurring, but in reality it's a human behind the curtain pulling the levers and pushing the buttons to make that magic occur. A good case study of that is Aardvark. Aardvark is a search engine for answering human-type questions, subjective questions. And while these are easy for a human to answer, they're more than likely difficult for a computer to answer. So the customers think a computer is providing the answer, but in reality, the MVP was a human providing the answers. But what it did was it verified the value of the service, and the customers liked it. And eventually Google purchased this service for $50 million. Another case study, Craigslist, a low-quality MVP that has basically become the product. It's a humble, no-frills newsletter and website. Many of you are familiar with that. It's wildly successful. Another case study was the IMVU avatar teleportation feature that Eric Rees and his team worked on. So IMVU wanted to add a feature that let users move their avatars around on a screen. And some of the challenges were, to be able to animate the walking from point A to point B, avoiding obstacles. You can't walk through an obstacle. Making angled turns, making elliptical shaped turns, etc. And so his team created a low-quality MVP where the user just clicks where he or she wants the avatar, and then the avatar magically transports to that position. And when they showed it to their customers, it turns out that their customers preferred the teleportation feature over any concept of animated movement from point A to point B. And there's other MVP patterns like smoke test, UI mockups, etc. Now, Lean Startup says once learning has been achieved, a decision needs to be made. And Lean Startup talks about the decisions of pivot and persevere. Since the publication of the book, a lot of documentation has been around 3 types of decisions: pivot, persevere, or quit. So for completeness sake, I'll use all 3 of those. Pivot is a structured course correction designed to test a new hypothesis. Persevere means continue with what we're doing. Let's move on to the next set of highest priority hypotheses. And then quit is obvious. It's cancel the project and move on to the next one. And there's a great quote in the book that says, there's no bigger destroyer of creative potential than the misguided direction or the misguided decision to persevere. Let's look at a case study of pivoting, Potbelly Sandwiches. This was originally an antique store. The owner decided to start selling sandwiches as a draw to drive traffic into the antique store. Well, the sandwiches became wildly popular, and most folks just came in to purchase a sandwich. Yeah, they looked at the antiques while they ate, but they weren't too interested in purchasing those. So the owner pivoted over to a sandwich shop, and today there are over 280 Potbelly sandwich stores nationwide. And as you might expect, there's different types of pivots. A zoom-in pivot. This is where we're going to refocus the whole product on what was previously considered one feature, because our customer base is extremely interested in that, and the activity around that is growing like wildfire. The inverse of that is a zoom out pivot, where a single feature is inadequate, so let's add some more additional value-added features. The customer need pivot, Potbelly was an example of that. An engine of growth pivot, so based on learnings, determine which features really drive the growth of the company, and then pivot over to those primarily exclusively. And pivots do take courage. Now, there's a lot baked into Lean Startup, including these three items. I'll quickly cover these three. Innovation accounting. Effectively, this is measuring the team's progress in terms of validated learning versus or instead of burn rate or number of features or story point velocity. It also includes the use of actionable metrics which show clear cause and effect. And a great quote from Reeves in the book: if you're building the wrong thing, optimizing the product or its marketing will not yield significant results. So again, how many of us have been in that situation in our careers? Let's talk about engine of growth. This one is tune the engine every time learning occurs. And we're going to do that based on a small set of actionable metrics. For example, customer acquisition costs, the number of activations, the retention rate, the revenue, the number of referrals, etc. And here's, consider the viral coefficient. Another great case study of that is Hotmail. In 1996, Hotmail began by offering free email accounts. Some of you may have used a Hotmail email account. Some of you still may have yours as of today. Their growth, though, at first was sluggish, and they made one small tweak to the product to tune the engine. And we all know what that was. At the bottom of every email message, they added the following: P.S. Get your free email at Hotmail, along with the clickable link. And then 18 months later, they had signed up 12 million new subscribers. And then the company was sold to Microsoft for $400 million. Whoops, sorry, I paged ahead. Adaptive organization. Finally, the Lean Startup organization is adaptive. We're going to adapt our process and organization as we go based on our learnings. And as much as possible, we're going to try to avoid handoffs, approvals, decisions on plausible sounding arguments. We're going to try to avoid low quality products and try to avoid defects because they slow you down. Okay, now I'd like to stop right here and check with Hemant and see if there's any burning questions that I might be able to answer before moving into the second half of the presentation, which is application to Agile projects.
Yeah, so maybe, Mike, we should take this one question. You talked about the MVPs and experiments idea. Do you have any guidance on how to prioritize which experiments to do first versus others?
Yes, and actually that's a topic coming up, but I'll go ahead and speak a little bit to it right now. it's mostly about which experiment will deliver the greatest amount of learning that is crucial right now. So in other words, if an experiment will help us make a decision whether or not to kill off the project, then that's a really good one to prioritize very high. And then, you can look at the remainder of the experiments and prioritize those based on a gauge or numeric score of, amount of learning involved. And, be careful though, because there may be some areas that you haven't learned anything about, and maybe it's starting to become more important for you to learn about those right now, because that may cause a pivot type decision. So you have to factor in the learning aspects or the potential learning aspects of these experiments and use that to kind of gauge, obviously the more learning, the higher priority it goes, and the more pertinent, crucial learning, I guess is the best way to say it, from a pivot or cancel the project type perspective, obviously float those to the top or near the top.
Okay, great. Thanks, Michael.
Sure. Okay, folks, let's talk about how to apply these lean startup principles to Agile projects. Okay, well, let's start with a case study. I'll be referring back to this from time to time throughout the rest of the presentation. So let's say we have a navigation API. It's called Nav API for short. And this is, maybe what we're building is a navigation platform that supports loading third-party apps integration onto that platform. And the goal of this particular project is to accurately measure the usage analytics of those third-party apps. For example, if the user starts driving or stops driving, maybe we want to measure that. When they route to a destination, maybe we want to measure how many times they've routed there and how many times they're using the routing feature, or how long in terms of time it takes to go from one destination or from your current location to a destination. Maybe there's travel guides built into the platform, and we want to measure how many times the user launches a specific travel guide. So one approach to this, which you could envision might have been done in a traditional planning approach with all kinds of assumptions baked in, would be, hey, our customers, our third-party app developers, will prefer a downloadable SDK to be integrated into their apps. And then the SDK could cache these measurements and send them up to a server every 5 minutes. And there's obviously some issues and costs associated with this. Every time we change the SDK, the third-party app developers are going to have to reintegrate, reissue the app, and get it recertified for our platform. Also, we're not perfect, so sometimes our SDK code actually causes a crash within the third-party app. So lots of issues and costs. You can imagine a company spending millions on this before they realize that the customer did not really want this particular solution. And if the product would have used lean startup principles, a lot of this pain and effort and cost could have been avoided to determine early on by testing hypotheses that the customers actually preferred a web services approach for a fraction of the cost of the original system. So again, that's kind of a case study that I'll refer back to throughout the rest of the presentation. So let's get started. Let's talk about hypothesis-driven vision. So you're probably familiar with a classic vision board as a way to get a good handle on what the vision of the project or product is. So we're going to take this concept and change it. We're going to add in a list of assumptions. And so that's a big difference between a standard vision board and a lean startup hypothesis-driven vision. We're going to list our assumptions, and for each one of those, we're going to translate them into a hypothesis. So here you can see a classic vision board for our nav API project. It covers, the standard sections. It has the elevator statement at the top. It covers the target group. It covers our needs, what the product really is, and what its value is. And then for Lean Startup, we're going to go ahead and list our major assumptions here. For example, customers will prefer a nav API over an embedded SDK. Okay, that's a huge assumption. We need to define some experiments to test that. And then the nav API will make it easier to certify apps. The nav API can handle a large amount of users, etc., etc. And for each one of those, we're going to translate it into a hypothesis statement. For example, greater than 80% of all customers will prefer the nav API over the embedded SDK, and on and on. So we're going to include assumptions and hypotheses statements right up front and include them within the classic vision board that a lot of Agile teams use. Next, let's take the concept of personas and let's morph it into something very valuable to a lean startup approach. So here right now you can see a traditional persona capture, and it talks about, this is how we're going to personalize the users and give them a name and give the development team some information about them so that we can build better products. Now for Lean Startup, what we're going to focus the persona on is to describe the knowledge sharing benefits that this role can provide and how we might learn from them. And this will help us prioritize our experiments and focus our experiments on certain personas. So for example, there's a list of items that this Kyle Fisher, a potential Drake Motors small SUV buyer, these are the areas of knowledge sharing that this person can impart upon us, and therefore we can kind of gauge the value of that and help us do our prioritization. Next, let's get organized and let's take the concept of a story map, but let's place a learning spin on the story map. So we're going to organize and prioritize a story map on the wall or within a tool, just like we do in our other Agile projects, but we're going to prioritize it by hypothesis from left to right. And we'll make decisions about which hypotheses are most, our highest priority, again, by what we talked about within the experiments, which deliver the most learning, which learnings are most crucial right now at this time, which learnings will reduce risk, and which learnings will either confirm or deny that we are building the right product. So for each hypothesis, we're going to name the user story and work items associated with that hypothesis and prioritize those stories and work items from top to bottom. So here you can see the nav API learning map on a wall, and for our hypotheses, we used the small yellow post-it notes. You'll see them there, and they're prioritized again from left to right. And then for our experiments and user stories, we used colored index cards that show right after the hypothesis that they are associated with. Again, the priority is left to right, and it's followed by top to bottom on the work items. Okay, let's tee it up. For the next use of Lean Startup principles and Agile projects, let's discuss the classic Scrum artifact, the product backlog. Most of you will be familiar with this. It contains the names of all work items for the project. Mostly it's about user story names, but there can be non-user story names in there. So in Lean Startup Agile, we're going to define these work items as experiments and then prioritize each based on primarily how much amount of learnings we think we can achieve. So here's an example. I know it's kind of hard to see, but it's an example of the nav API experiment backlog. The most important thing is this colored row there where we actually list the hypothesis that is being tested, and each hypothesis is followed by a number of work items. Those are the rows within this spreadsheet, and these rows are, if they're user stories, they're described in classic user story format. If they're just work items or tasks, then there's a short blurb and description about that specific experiment. Okay, let's get focused. The minimum learning product. So, you know, let's call the MVP what it really is. It's a minimum learning product, or MLP. So it's similar to the MVP. It may be, you know, much smaller than an MVP. It's learnings-based, not necessarily viable product-based. So it may not be full-level production code because, again, the focus is on learning. I would say a primary consideration in Lean Startup is learning. A secondary but very important consideration is you know, production-level code, because we don't want low quality or defects to slow us down. So it's really a balance between those. And think of it as the smallest chunk of the learning map that can be developed to learn something really important. Our goal is to get just enough learnings to make an important decision, and then choosing the MLP actually replaces the classic Scrum sprint planning. So you would have an MLP planning session. So in our first planning session for the nav API, we came up with the following MLP. And as you can see, it's the first two experiments associated with the very first hypothesis. Now, in support of build, measure, learn loop, let's define a development activity called the experiment, test, iteration, the ETI. And like a Scrum sprint, it contains full lifecycle development. Also, like a Scrum sprint, the output can be considered a product increment, but again, the focus is more on learning. But unlike Scrum, the length of the ETI is dictated by the size of the learning effort. We're not so concerned about a 2-week or 4-week heartbeat of consistency, because we don't want to necessarily fill in 2 weeks with 3 ETIs, and then what if the third ETI is longer than the 2-week time frame expiration? So we're going to take a little flexibility here with Scrum and say, okay, we're going to define ETIs, but they can be variable length. And yeah, we'll set a target date out there and try our best to hit it. But if we don't hit it, then we go a day longer or we finish a day earlier, we're not going to be too concerned about that. So recall that we want to get through the build measure loop as quickly as possible. And also, you know, again, I want to stress the output of the ETI is primarily about learning, but it's also about high quality software. So, you know, it may not hit the potentially shippable software mark, but it is definitely a major step towards the MMP, or the Release 1 product. So as we're building it, we're going to make sure our work items result in validated learning. So we're going to add a validated column to the sprint backlog, or the storyboard as shown. Now, this is not QA validation. QA validation occurs between in work and done. This is customer validation. customer validation occurs between done and validated. So you might think, whoa, well that means our ETI is going to be much longer than we originally planned, possibly. So we have to introduce this concept of a learning results period. And this basically says, look, once we complete an ETI and we're able to give something to the client, they are going to need some time to assess it, and we're going to need some time to gather the data. Now, while we're waiting for their assessment or the data to come in, we can go ahead and kick off another ETI with our next highest priority experiments to be done during that time. So in many respects, the learning results period can run in parallel with our actual ETI development. Now, at some point, the learning results period is completed. At that point, we'll hold, a demonstration, a review, and a retrospective, and gather and discuss the data, and then make the decision to pivot, persevere, or quit. We'll also ask at that point, does the current ETI that we're currently working on still make sense? And then a decision to pivot, persevere, or quit just within even that ETI. Okay, so let's demo our findings. This is similar to a sprint review, but more about looking at the data obtained during the learning results period. And this is where the decision will be made to pivot, persevere, or quit. Retrospectives are always a good idea. Whether you're Agile, Scrum, or Lean Startup, it's always a good idea to promote continuous improvement. But the Lean Startup retrospective adds in this little twist. We're also going to query the team members. How are you feeling about the assumptions that have been identified so far? Are there any other assumptions that we now know of or were not previously identified? And again, we're going to constantly ask, what are the assumptions we're making? And how can we translate those into a hypothesis? And let's list some experiments to prove or disprove that hypothesis. And then building is rinse and repeat successive versions of the minimum learning product in order to reach a final launchable product, or the MMP. We're going to tune the growth engine as we go, and we're going to be very courageous in our pivot or persevere or quit decisions. Now, a couple of slides about team dynamics. You want as much as possible for the Scrum team to become a small innovation factory. And you want the Scrum team to practice this art of Genchi Genbutsu. And what that says is we want to emphasize spending time with the customer. That's what really matters. So don't accept it when someone tells you that you can't. I can't tell you how many times in my training classes when I ask, a question, do you have access to the customer? The immediate answer is always, oh, no. No, somebody, fill in the blank, whoever, would never allow that. Okay, well, you should treat that as an organizational dysfunction and do some things to get closer, at least closer to the customer, if not plugged in with them. So spending time with the customer is where the real learning takes place. And Lean Startup, or Lean, actually has this term called Gimba. And that's, I believe it's a Chinese word meaning the real place. And this is where the customer's real work is occurring. You can't go to the real place by sitting in your office every day. So they have this concept of a Gimba walk. And this is to actually visit with the customer and walk and see their process in action. And it gives you direct customer interaction. And most importantly, you're going to be learning. So Toyota Lean Manufacturing also has this concept of a chief engineer called SHUSA, responsible for all product decisions. In our world, we want the Scrum Master to aspire to this level of leadership and then guide the team on their experiments and MOP deliveries in pursuit of a righteous product. Okay, let's wrap up. Lean startup principles can and should be used in Agile projects. Remember, we can still build the wrong thing using Agile methods. We'll build it faster and with better quality, no doubt. But in the end, who cares? Presented today approximately 10 techniques: the hypothesis-driven vision board, knowledge broker personas, learning maps, experiment backlogs, NLP, ETI, etc., etc. And I believe that this could be the next major evolution of Agile. So to the audience, I'd like to introduce Gimba. It's a validated method. And I believe this is the next great evolution of Agile. Now, Gimba inherits strongly from Scrum. It inherits strongly from Lean. It inherits strongly from Lean startups. So it's not anything brand new. You can think of it as derivative, or it's an instantiation of the Agile class, if you will. And Gimba results in fast development and delivery model that helps ensure we're building the right product. So the Gimba manifesto would read like this: we're going to value validated learning, that's on the left side, over reasonable assumptions. Your assumptions may be reasonable, but let's test those out, and let's make decisions based on validated learning. We're going to value data-driven decisions objectively over plausible sounding arguments. We're going to value building MLPs over adding additional features. And we're going to value the courage to build the right thing over something that just might work. Okay, 3 beacons. We do a lot of Agile training, Scrum, user stories, Intro to Agile. We've recently added some Lean startup training, and obviously Agile consulting. So with that, I'm going to wrap and turn it back over to Hemant for any questions, and I'll go ahead and advance to the center zip slide.
Great, thanks, Mike. So we have a number of questions, and I would encourage audience to keep sending in their questions as they reflect on the material that Mike, you covered. And while they're doing that, let me just do a quick intro to SynerZip for those who may not be familiar with us. So Mike, if you can advance to the next page. In a couple pages, in a few seconds, I'll introduce SynerZip. So this is SynerZip in a nutshell. We are a software product development partner for typically small to mid-sized, often venture-backed growth stage software companies. And we help them by putting together a high-caliber, dedicated team for each of our clients that serves as an extension of the in-house product team, and provides. We're providing teams to our clients to do rapid Agile development work following Lean startup principles along the way. And through the good quality process of both Lean startup as well as Agile development practices, we help our clients reduce the risk of development, build the right product and the right quality, so that helps our clients scale faster, better. And along the way, we are able to also reduce the cost by leveraging our dual shore model, which is we have a development center in India and a team on the US side, and that combination we are able to provide a 50% cost advantage to our clients, and also provide flexibility, long-term flexibility to our clients, which is whenever the team gets to a point where our clients feel like they want to convert it to a captive team for reasons of exit considerations, so on, they can do that with our support. So that's SynerZip in a nutshell. This page in front of you is a glimpse of some of our clients, and you can see a good mix in here. You may recognize some of the names, but in general, mid-sized software companies, typically venture-backed growth stage companies. So that's who we are, and we'd love to work with any of you if you have a need. And let me also put a little plug in for our upcoming Agile Texas Tour. Agile conference is coming up in the first week of August. Right after attending that conference, Vinayak, our CTO, and I, we do a little road show, covered our top 10 takeaways from the recently completed Agile conference. So we'll do that in Dallas, Austin, and Houston on August 11th, 12th, and 13th respectively. And you're welcome to sign up to attend any one or more of these. So stay tuned for that invitation. And we have a webinar coming up next month on a technical topic of Spark, from Hadoop to Spark. So this is going to be exciting topic for you guys to listen to. So with that, let's start taking questions now for this topic. So as I'm looking at the list of questions, let me take the first one, Mike, on the topic of applying lean startup principles to Agile. So you covered this notion of ETI, experiment test cycle. So any advice on how to balance the consideration? Typical Agile teams are pushed to produce production quality software. Every sprint has to be production ready software to be able to be deployed, and that's the best practice in the Agile context. But in the lean startup principles, we talk about validated learning as more important than production ready. So how do you reconcile, how do you help teams reconcile these two considerations?
Well, for sure, in lean startup, the validated learning aspect is more important than full production quality code. So it's similar to what I said before. There is a primary consideration and there is a secondary consideration. And lean startup teams will shoot for both, no doubt. But if they have to add a little bit of, I guess, technical debt in order to achieve a learning from a particular experiment, they will absolutely do that and not feel bad about it because learning trumps anything else. So, but that said, one thing throughout the entire book that Reese makes a very good point of is that attention to technical excellence and attention to software quality and avoidance of defects goes right in hand with this approach, because those are the kind of things that slow you down. And so it's not only about building the right product, it's about getting the learnings as fast as you can and making those pivot or persevere or quit decisions as quickly as you can. So it's really a two-pronged approach, but learning does, so when you have to make the hard decision, it's like, you know, on the Agile Manifesto, there's a left side and a right side, and we respect both sides. But when a hard decision is to be made, we're going to make it on the left side, and that's in the learning category.
Great, Mike, thanks. So let's push that just a little bit further. So if a team has to make a decision, they're building a feature and they need to validate whether that feature is going to be useful for the end customer or not. So they have to validate that fact. So to deliver that feature 2 weeks earlier and get the learning advantage 2 weeks earlier, and they can get, by cutting corners of, let's say, not doing unit test cases or not doing test automation or not doing scalable design. So taking on technical debt to be able to gain time advantage of learning, you're advising that that's more valuable to get faster learning.
Yep. Now, yes, I do agree with that, and I know, you know, some software folks are turning over in their graves right now.
Right.
But that's what's different about this approach than Scrum.
Right.
Now, a couple of just a couple of thoughts there. Reese, any lean startup disciple would never say that software quality is not important. What we're saying is that it goes hand in hand with learning, but when the tough choice needs to be made, the learning is more important. So if you have to make that tough choice within an ETI to put in a temporary solution in order to achieve the learnings, and remember the different kind of patterns we talked about, you know, a man behind the scenes or Wizard of Oz or a cheap MLP or MVP or whatever. That type of approach is supported by the lean startup principles because, we may have to fake it for a certain amount of time before the real solution is available. But if we fake it and we gain some valuable learnings from that, then that is more valuable than the real solution being ready at that time. So here's what you should do when you have to make that tough decision. Add the finish out or production level items to your backlog. It may be a different backlog than your experiments, or these items may be interspersed in with your experiment backlog. But somehow flag them or indicate them as this isn't really an experiment. This is a follow-on activity we have to do to make our code production ready, which resulted out of the learnings from an experiment.
Great. Thanks. Let's take another question, Mike. Some teams struggle with the fact that they feel they can't settle for minimum viable product or minimum kind of a scope to validate. They feel they have only one shot at showing their wonderful product to a client or demoing it to the client to win that order, that customer order.
Right.
So how do you reconcile, or how do you help them deal with this concern that they really can't afford to do minimum viable product? They have to do a complete product to have a viable business opportunity.
Yeah. Okay, two thoughts there. One is this is a very good reason to make sure that your experiment backlog is prioritized ruthlessly with those items that will give the most learning, because ostensibly 1 month, 3 months, 6 months later, you're going to be going before a customer and showing them your more fully featured out product. And so you want it to contain the items or your solution about those experiments that you will get the best feedback from the customer. And secondly, it's always a good idea in that situation to find what I would call an internal proxy within your company to play that role as customer proxy or stakeholder, and let us use them to cross-check these ETIs and get there. And actually it could be an organization. It doesn't just have to be limited to one person, but kind of proxy that customer feedback internally within your company, so at least there's that. Is it the end customer's feedback? No, but if that internal proxy has a connection to your customer, they can figure out a way to, with a weekly teleconference, just ask them some questions and kind of validate what the proxy is telling the development team. So institute an internal proxy type scheme to play the customer role as you do the lean startup ETIs.
Okay, excellent, thanks. Let's take one more question we have time for. So as the teams go through this cycle of learning and they pivot or persevere as they learn from the feedback objectively, they may along the way in the speed to get validated learning sign up for a lot of technical debt, whether they are missing unit test cases or shortcuts on architecture and design and all that. So how do you keep track of the technical debt along the way, and do you feel at some point the concern is here in the question that once you pivot multiple times based on these learnings, the technical debt might become unmanageable?
Well, I guess it could. Again, though, I want to stress the idea here is to create your MLPs with both, that satisfy learnings and it's high quality software. So the first and foremost, using that as an internal goal and mantra is one way to help manage it and hopefully avoid the system where it's just riddled with technical debt. Secondly, Agile in its purest form gives us a way to manage technical debt. Every technical debt item that's identified goes into the product backlog. And then it becomes a matter of, product owner or whoever is doing the prioritization to prioritize certain aspects of that, higher versus lower. But here's the thing, with Lean Startup, if you focus on learning primarily, and yes, quality as an additional consideration, your learnings may drive you away from something that you thought previously, and therefore this handful of 5 technical debt items in that area are even no longer relevant. So that's why you have to manage the technical debt ruthlessly. Use your product backlog and use prioritization based on what you're learning to decide which of those technical debt items to do when it's when it's finally getting close to the launch.
Great. Thanks, Mike. And let me add one other comment one of the audience members made, is that this is also good advice, to make MVP as small as possible, to limit the technical debt that you may incur. Excellent. Well, thank you, Mike, for covering this topic, and thanks all of you who participated in today's session. Stay tuned for next month's Hadoop to Spark on August 19, and then August 11, 12, 13. Join us in Austin, Houston, Dallas, or wherever you can. If you would like to listen top 10 takeaways from the Agile conference next